This is Never Close the Inquiry with Nick Hagan. Welcome to Never Close the Inquiry, where I aim to demystify the right for the left and the left for the right. Where if you come as a conservative, I want you to leave knowing a little bit more about liberals. And if you come as a liberal, I want you to leave knowing a little bit more about conservatives. With the whole idea that over time we'll create better conversations, better relationships, better arguments, and maybe 80 or 90 more steps down the road, a better country. All right. Karen Vaites.
Yes.
Great to have you on. So, Karen Vaites, you are the writer behind School Yourself on Substack. You are the founder of the Curriculum Insight Project, and we are going to talk about education policy, specifically, I think, insofar as it relates to literacy. So, first, can you give me a little bit of background? What exactly is it you do, and how did you get started doing it?
It's a great question, and thank you so much for having me. I could talk about these topics all day, so um, really a pleasure to speak. I became an accidental education advocate by falling into work in K-12 education, where I was doing a mix of communications-related work and some marketing work,
Mhm.
um, all with the goal of trying to bring better practices and better schooling for kids. And I worked, for example, I was the chief marketing officer at a not for profit that was giving away super high quality curriculum for free as open educational resources. And we also would sell some services. So we were still a bit of a traditional marketer, but we were a not for profit.
Mhm.
Um, that's the type of work that I've been doing over the last, decade plus. And one of the things I learned along the way was that to be effective in any roles that I had as a marketer, I had to learn more and more about how kids learn to read. And the first thing that I was tasked with helping to communicate to K 12 educators was actually the Common Core standards. So I had to really get to know the evidence base behind the Common Core standards when they rolled out
Yeah.
a bit over a decade ago.
Okay.
And along the way, I had some professionals who were experts in research say to me, you know, just by doing these roles for a few years and what you've had to learn to do your job, you probably know more about how kids learn to read than the average American teacher. And that floored me. Um, those comments and those realizations for me predated what's been described as the science of reading movement today.
Yeah.
We've witnessed 5, 6 years of really strong journalism, advocacy, and national discourse about how kids learn to read.
Yeah.
So this work that I've come to do, which is to help communicate mostly to educators, but also to a degree to parents about how kids learn, which practices and which curricula in schools are aligned to those learning sciences, and what are the most effective levers to raise reading and math outcomes. That's become something become downright passionate to the point of obsessive about. And today I do generally mostly advocacy and communications to help more people understand the things I've had the privilege to get to know.
Yeah. So how that's fascinating, and I love that idea of kind of accidentally landing on a life mission as you go along. Um, how are we doing reading and math wise?
It's the best of times and it's the worst of times. And
Okay.
so if I start with the most important part, I suppose they're equally important. We are at a trough in national reading and math outcomes. If we look at the last, 20-year time horizon, the combination of COVID and probably some other forces have taken our national reading and math outcomes to fairly worrisome places.
Okay.
And this comes after there was a sort of 2-decade phase where we were seeing an initial rise in those outcomes, and the dip that came from COVID um, is marked, but actually the declines, now that we can look back on them, the declines probably started about a decade ago. And to a worrisome degree, if we look at our 2024 NAEP outcomes, there's a national exam called the NAEP that's done in every state.
Okay.
It's a sampling study, so we get a pretty healthy sample of how our kids doing, and we can look at state by state comparisons.
Hmm.
Um, our performance in reading and math on the NAEP in 2024 was actually weaker than in 2022, which is probably the biggest red flag.
Yeah.
That says to us that whatever happened in the COVID dip, we're not successfully, as school systems and as a society, managing to rebound from that dip. So that's all pretty troubling news. And I would want every parent and policymaker out there to know that these are our realities. The good news, and
Yeah.
it's the part I like spending most of the time talking about, frankly, as much as we can. Um, the good news is that we're starting to have some nice examples of states that are doing consistent things
Yeah.
and managing to raise statewide outcomes as part of reform and improvement efforts.
Yeah.
So there are 4 states in the South that I talk the most about because these 4 states, Tennessee, Mississippi, Louisiana, and Alabama,
Hmm.
have all rebounded since the pandemic. They have all shown growth since the pandemic. They're the only 4 states to show meaningful growth in their reading outcomes, and also in most of them in their math outcomes too. And there's a common playbook they're using.
Okay.
So if anything, that might be the most important story in the country, because where you have 4, you have a trend, and
Yeah.
there's nothing happening in those states that couldn't happen in the other 46.
Well, that is very exciting. But so let's start. Let's go back a little bit. Do we have a good sense of what started this downward trend initially? A decade ago.
It's such a good question. And I would say we're in the middle of some healthy debates about why that downturn, which became pronounced during COVID, but
Hmm.
the downward slope was present about a decade ago. There are those that point to the weakening of accountability systems.
Okay.
So in the decade prior to that, that decade was the No Child Left Behind decade, where federal legislation was passed that required more accountability efforts, most notably stronger forms of state assessments in every state in order to be eligible for federal funding.
Hmm.
But um, in general, that wave of accountability push, some point to that and say apparently that accountability was the thing that was working when we had a slight upward slope, and when that accountability was softened during the Obama era,
Hmm.
um, that actually states kind of let their guard down. That's one theory.
Yeah.
There's another discussion we have that closely parallels the discussions we're having about social media and
Mm.
phones and the digitally dominated life.
Yeah.
There's another theory that says a decade ago is when smartphones became fairly prevalent, um, and kids started having them in their hands too. It would be impossible to ignore that actually, at about the same time, there was a push for one-to-one devices within US schools. So the
Yeah.
question mark about the question mark about technology in student hands that they can be pulling out of their pockets and can be a distraction, that's one potential culprit.
Hmm.
There's the potential culprit, which is schools shifting to more digital learning modalities. Um, additionally, and then there are still a few others that folks,
Hmm.
debate about. The truth is, and we know that COVID's a factor in the midst of it. The truth is, I don't think that we have anything like the sort of research base at this point to be able to say conclusively that it's necessarily led by one of those things. It
Hmm.
could easily be a combination of those things, but all of those are factors that we should be thinking about as we think about, a la, how do we imitate the Southern Surge states? There's
Yeah.
also, how can we start to reflect on those shifts and even design research to help us understand which of those are the most leading culprits here.
Yeah, and all of that, it still seems very relevant, including the stuff that's kind of we've now left in the past somewhat. Obviously, devices are still everywhere, and now we've got AI that is starting to enter the things. I know there are a lot of people advocating for
Yeah.
the use of AI in teaching, and then coming at this as someone who, I wouldn't even say I've been on the periphery of the education debates. Just the sort of person that occasionally reads articles, but I was. Uh, I was in high school by I think the time we really had No Child Left Behind, and then
Yeah.
in college and beyond by the time we had Common Core. So what I hear of those pardon, what I hear of those programs is typically not super positive, but I don't really know anything about them or why the reviews wouldn't be positive. And it would be, if you could somehow summarize those briefly and explain the criticisms, and then if we could, and then the reason it'd be great to get your thoughts on that is because then, now during the Trump administration 2.0, very interesting time, potential dismantling of the Department of Education and all that. So it'd be interesting to hear your thoughts on that evolution, so to speak. That was
Very
a
interesting
big
time.
question. Sorry.
Yeah, no, it is a big question. And so let me speak first to the sort of question mark about the Common Core.
Yeah.
And then also, your second question was about the potential role of ed tech. Was that number two, or was it Common Core? And
Yeah. I think I might have snuck about 5 questions in there. Yeah. So let's
there
go.
were a few things.
Okay, yeah, let's go Common Core first. What are the criticisms of Common Core? What are the advantages or disadvantages of moving away from a sort of nationalized policy, and then to the extent we had that before, and then
Yeah.
ed tech. Yeah.
Yeah. So let's talk about the Common Core, because this one, I didn't name it for reasons that I'll get into as one of the potential culprits for what happened a decade ago, because that's not my read of the evidence.
Okay.
When the Common Core came out 10 years ago, it has never been a national set of standards per se. It was a collaboration between the leading state education chief in each state. So there's an organization called the CCSSO, which is basically all of those state education officers getting together for knowledge sharing collaboration. And in the pre-Common Core era, there were a number of things they were starting to point to that said maybe having 50 different sets of standards is flawed. First of all, there were 50 fairly radically different outcomes happening. So there was a question mark of, should we be taking the states that are best practice, like Massachusetts, that notoriously had the strongest scores back in that era, and trying to model everyone's standards more closely to the leaders?
Yeah.
So that was one question mark. But we were in the No Child Left Behind era, and state leaders in the CCSSO were starting to talk about the expense of administering state exams. Because believe it or not, designing an assessment to a set of standards is not a trivial or inexpensive endeavor. So you had this duplicative work happening in 50 states, each having to deliver, design, administer 50 different assessments, and the cost of this was creeping up.
Yeah.
So the Common Core was this conceptual, could we come up with a set of standards that at least many of us could agree to? And if you talk with the Common Core authors, they'll tell you no one expected this to be a 50 state thing when they first started that work. They said, if we managed to get 20 states to sign on to this, well, then you'd basically manage to have a buy-in cohort of states that could go source and buy a common assessment. They could source and buy common curricula. It was also known back in those days that major publishers designed curricula for the biggest states. So you could get the curriculum that aligned to the California standards, the Texas standards, or the Florida standards, and everyone else got whatever was closest to one of those three things. So again, the Common Core was conceptually, if we could get a set of common standards, then a large cohort of states, however large, could opt into those things.
Okay.
In the end, 45 states adopted into the Common Core. So it started to operate as close to a nationalized approach to teaching.
Really quickly,
this is also
which five didn't?
Oh gosh, it's been a decade, so I'm going to forget. I know Texas was one.
Okay.
I want to say Texas, Alaska, Indiana might have been 3.
Okay.
But I'm afraid I would have to go back.
No worries.
And do some. I'm sure in an AI age, someone can go back and figure this out. The truth is, in each of those 5 states, the standards adopted by those 5 states was similar enough to the Common Core that the state leaders could still go out and purchase, or district leaders could still go get Common Core aligned curricula and be close enough. So again, the truth is, in each of those 5 states, they were all states where the Common Core became a bit of a political football. So it almost felt like education leaders put together, the Common Core under any other name as their standards, but passed something that was pretty darn close.
Right.
And those standards were, I don't think anyone would say that any country has achieved the perfect set of standards, but they were internationally benchmarked. So the
Hmm.
design of the Common Core was heavily influenced by what are leading countries doing, the countries leading on international exams. What do their standards look like?
Hmm.
Notoriously, our math standards look not terribly dissimilar, or they're maybe most closely modeled on the Singapore standards because that was a leading country back when the Common Core was designed. And then you also had this state style benchmarking. So
Hmm.
many people will say the Common Core looks most similar to Massachusetts among state standards. So this was this effort to just take our standards, which are not the curriculum, but they are a set of benchmarks that schools should hit. You can think of them like fuel efficiency standards. You can design a car a lot of ways as long as a car of X weight can get Y numbers of miles per gallon.
Yeah.
Um, but again, they don't necessarily drive the driving experience. You can still design lots of cars and place the cup holders where you want. In a
Right.
similar vein, the Common Core standards are there to articulate what grades a child should be able to add single digit numbers in, for example. So
Okay.
you could teach a lot of different curricula as long as you can get those kids to hit those milestones
Okay. Yeah.
on that timeline. So with all of that said, um, the Common Core, I think it's fair to say that standards based reform didn't produce national gains.
Hmm.
Um, that much feels inarguable at this point.
Yeah.
Why is that? Is that there are a few potential culprits for that. It took publishers many years before folks in the field believed that the most popular curricula aligned to the Common Core.
Hmm.
So we had a gap between new standards and materials that aligned. I personally think that's one of the biggest reasons that the Common Core style of teaching was slow to get off the ground.
Hmm.
Um, there's the sheer fact that a lot of districts kind of kept doing what they were doing anyway. So there's also this fairly healthy evidence that, we know on the literacy space, for example, that curricula that aligned to the Common Core, um, or curricula that were clearly not aligned, all these balanced literacy curricula that the Common Core authors would have told you, those things are really not designed for
Hmm.
teaching to these new standards, but they stayed rooted in classrooms in about 40% of US schools for at least 5 years after the Common Core.
Oh, wow.
So you
Okay.
have evidence we can point to
Yeah.
say you can put out new standards, but if there's no forcing mechanism for schools to change how they're teaching,
Hmm.
then we absolutely saw schools more or less take the publisher's word or take the author's word or take someone's word that sure this is Common Core aligned, but any close watcher would say it wasn't.
Got it.
The
Okay.
third culprit, I think, is in fact EdTech. If we look at this decade after the Common Core was adopted, um, districts were not necessarily, and teachers, if we look at, what conferences people were going to and where attention was going, there's a lot of evidence that people were much more focused on bringing devices into classrooms and redesigning instruction to accommodate technology
Yeah.
during this, because the Common Core decade was the one-to-one device decade as well. Those happen
Yeah.
in parallel. So that's another potential culprit that the distraction factor of teaching with tech took away from the focus on the real instructional gore. Part of the reason that I say that those are culprits and I don't just say they were bad standards,
Yeah.
it's, we should flush those standards and start over, is that when we talk about the Southern Surge states, the two states that took most seriously, the Common Core mandate were Louisiana and Tennessee. And Louisiana started first back in 2013. They had really strong leadership. They really pushed to get Common Core aligned, significantly better designed curricula into schools. They made major investments in teacher training
Yeah.
aligned with those curricula. So we're going to give teachers better tools and train them on how to use it. In the last few years, they also layered in some uh, training of teachers on the science of reading. How do kids learn to read fundamentals?
Hmm.
And a decade into that work, Louisiana has topped the charts on growth in reading post pandemic.
Yeah.
Tennessee pursued a really similar model, but a couple years delayed. And Tennessee is also showing up on the national stage with gains to show for its investments. So if you're me, I look at it and I say, okay, clearly new standards wasn't a forcing mechanism for every state to
Yeah.
make these kinds of shifts. But in the two states where at scale they did make these shifts, they're the states delivering gains. So I don't think we can call failure on the Common Core specifically I think we need to talk about different we need different methods and levers and incentives and accountability mechanisms to get other states to make some of those similar shifts.
Yeah.
Um, because the same gains that, again, in Tennessee and Louisiana, they didn't do anything special that couldn't be happening in my state and yours.
Yeah. Okay. So I have two questions now that come out of that. One, I want to talk a little bit more about ed tech, and then two, I want to get a real sense of what these, what Tennessee and Louisiana and the southern surge states, what exactly it is they're doing that other states are not doing. Just to have a really concrete picture of that, and like
Absolutely.
why other states are not doing it. So back to the ed tech thing. So
Mhm.
my bias, let's see, you know, I remember when I was in high school. So I graduated from high school in 2008. By the time I graduated, I think there were like 2 kids in my graduating class that had an iPhone, and it was kind of the kids that
Yeah.
are pretty well off and I don't know, tech savvy. They had them, but no one else did. Then by the time a few years later, everyone's got one, and you have laptops in class, and certainly in law school, I had a couple of professors that didn't allow laptops, but for the most part, people are there taking notes with their laptops in class. And I can say for myself, a laptop was a very efficient mechanism of distraction, and I read a great
Mhm.
deal of unrelated things while in class. And so I have this informed by my own being unable to keep what I would hope were my standards against having devices in classrooms. What, like the proponents of having devices in classrooms, do they still stick to those arguments? And if so, why?
It's been interesting to watch, and I'm not. I have sort of ridden this wave full circle, if you will.
Yeah.
A decade ago, when there was a lot of optimism about the potential of technology, and certainly we've seen technology improve outcomes in lots of different fields, you know, in the country. So it didn't seem far fetched to believe that technology could, in fact, accelerate learning. And it is still the case. We can talk about some edge cases mostly, but we can talk about some cases where, in fact, technology is, in fact, a net benefit for, here's a particular learning approach, here's a particular way of delivering, virtual tutoring or
Yeah.
this or that. So I don't want to be throwing babies out with bathwater.
Right.
But when we think about core instruction, and I'm going to focus on elementary school in this conversation because I think it's where um,
Yeah.
we have some of the best evidence. We know things now that we didn't know a decade ago. Like we know that for elementary and middle school children, if they're reading on a digital device, their reading comprehension is lower than if they read an equivalently complex bit of text on a piece of paper and answer comprehension questions.
That's
That for
fascinating.
me,
Do we know why
yeah,
that is?
I don't think that we're at a point where we can point to the why.
Yeah.
I will
We just
say
know.
that observation's in lab studies. So in a
Yeah.
lab study, someone is there next to the child, and the effect that I'm describing isn't happening because the kid is going off task and off surfing the web while no
Right.
one's looking over the shoulder. This is happening in lab studies. And so to me, someday we'll figure out the why, but I don't know that the why matters at this point.
Right.
We know
Yeah.
the what,
Yeah.
and that's something that I think we need to be a lot more reflective about.
Yeah.
Um, we also know, a lot of the ed tech that came out in V1 ed tech, and I say this as someone that was one of the products where I was a chief marketing officer was a tech enabled product, and it was a
Hmm.
literacy product. It had conceptually its virtues. Um, but most of the uses of tech, but we see a lot of uses of tech that look like instead of doing a writing assignment, do a PowerPoint. And here we have a student, in theory, they're both writing. In
Yeah.
theory, they're both communications. In practice, we know there's something when we talk about learning sciences called cognitive load. And, my working memory can only process 3 to 5 things at one time. I can hold 3 to 5 different things in my head to get something done. And each new thing you layer on, I can't simultaneously read a book and answer questions and write and also be driving, right?
Right.
We can only do a certain number of things effectively and focus our attention. Well, as soon as you're asking a student to move from write me a 5-paragraph essay to create a PowerPoint, suddenly I'm not really focusing my energy on the writing craft as much as I am the design craft and
Mm.
the thinking about how the technology is used and how to save this document and how I import images. And suddenly I'm going from writing to something that's arguably in part visual design.
Yeah.
And then you've got that tech overhead layer. And each time you really go to look at the use case of a technology tool, we're often just seeing that there isn't a there there, um, in part because you can get into the nuances and point to specific ways that the technology serves as more of a distraction from what the core task was than necessarily a boon.
Yeah.
And that's before we talk about the idea that schools have been sold lots of kind of fluffy software that's more edutainment than necessarily educational.
Right.
So it's a lot of layers. I don't think that there's one layer, and to what the reasons might be that
Mm-hmm.
tech, again, and it's pretty inarguable a decade into this, tech has not improved learning outcomes.
Yeah.
Period. End of story.
Yep.
Or we'd see it in the data. Um, so if you're me, I think uh, I'd love to see better understandings of this because we're now at a point where I've started to see good meta analyses done on, okay, well, so what are the effects of even specific technologies? And we really can't find we can't find any strong evidence that bringing tech into classrooms has been, a source of forward progress or a source of academic improvements. So at this point, it's about figuring out how do we walk back the things that we know are definitely distractive, and how do we start to identify those things that are true powerful uses of tech and sort of align when students use the tech to those specific use cases, as
Mm-hmm.
opposed to it's math, so everybody just pull out your Chromebook and we're going to be doing math within your Chromebook. And
Yeah.
again, all of those details are before we talk about the point you just made, which is it's just too easy in most school environments under most school firewalls for kids to find ways around these things because they do,
Yeah.
and to be spending their time hanging out on the web instead of focusing the lesson.
Right.
That distraction factor is after we talk about all of the things that, if that distraction factor doesn't exist, we
Mm-hmm.
still have some worry points when it comes to tech.
Yeah. Oh man. As someone who, a bit of a semi-intentional Luddite, I love to hear this. Very I'm very biased in favor of what you're saying now. So it's great to hear this fantastic confirmation. I love it.
Well, it must be said,
Yeah.
you and I and parents all over the country, I can't tell you how many parent conversations I've had like this,
Yeah.
and a lot of leading teachers talk this way.
Hmm.
It is still the case, though, that school systems have spent millions upon millions of dollars on these devices. There's I would say the average educator is still not having these conversations about
Yeah.
walking back tech. Only in the last year am I really even seeing meaningful teacher momentum saying, "Really? Is this really a good use of time?" Only in
Yeah.
the last few months have I started to see things like an editorial from Michael Bloomberg questioning what percentage of the school day kids spend on technology.
Mm-hmm.
So I think we're just at the beginning of the course correction here, and we can't talk about it enough.
Duly noted. Make to talk about that. Okay. All right. Yeah. Become advocate for against. Okay. Great. Um. Okay. Then back to. Okay. Fascinating. So, what are the Southern Surge states doing concretely that others like? How do kids learn how to read? I know how I learned how to
Mhm.
read, but I don't know how. You know, there are plenty of people who just kind of pick it up, and then other people who hooked on phonics or whatever. How do people learn how to read?
It's a good question. And I'm going to focus on, again, those early reading foundations at sort of the beginning of the answer because you know, there's a richness to the answer and what we want to be happening for kids to be more successful as readers, comprehenders, learners that vary by grades. But first things first, it's critical that kids be able to read with what we describe as automaticity and to be able to read fluently, naturally, without having to stop and pause. And,
Yeah.
I think, as an efficient reader, if you're a successful reader, you really aren't stopping and pausing to laboriously break down words and sentences as you go. You are kind of flowing, you have that flow state going on.
Yeah.
So achieving that's about a couple things. Um, one thing we want for students is we want all kids to be able to decode new words that they haven't seen before with that ease and that similar automaticity that we're describing. So it's important that in between kindergarten and second grade, kids get super strong reading foundations in phonics, phonemic awareness, the ability to break down words from in kindergarten, we're starting with simple words, cat, bat. As they get
Mm-hmm.
into upper grades, we also want to be focusing on kids being able to break down more complex multisyllabic words. We're seeing some pretty good research to show that kids that struggle decoding multisyllabic words are often kids that struggle with reading into upper grades and middle school. So it's critical that all kids learn that code of the English language,
Mm-hmm.
where when we teach phonics, we're really teaching kids when they see, we're teaching them letter sound correspondence.
Mm.
And there are 42 sounds in the English language, only 26 letters.
Yeah.
So we want students to know that when they see the TH, that
Mm-hmm.
makes the sound th or th. We
Mm-hmm.
want kids to know that if they encounter TH at the end of a word, they're typically going to hear that softer th, the word with
Yeah.
ending softer. If they encounter the th at the beginning of a word, like this, that, they're typically going to have more of that vibrating th.
Yeah.
Um, so if we teach kids all of those sound letter correspondences and how the English language typically breaks down, while it's not perfect, there are going to be some irregular words that don't follow the patterns. 85% of words do, in fact, follow those patterns. And we can equip kids to quickly process words as they read them by making that phonics and phonemic awareness investment.
Yeah.
Beyond that, as we get into what makes me a successful and fluent reader in other grades and arenas, we need to talk about the importance of vocabulary and
Yeah.
content knowledge.
Yeah.
Because if I show you a really simple sentence or few about biophysics, and you're not a biophysicist, and it has simple sentence structure and it's not making a complex point necessarily, you'll still struggle to understand that paragraph if you don't know biophysics because you don't know the
Right.
concepts that it's talking about. You don't have a schema for biophysics. You probably don't know a lot of the key vocabulary words that come up in biophysics.
Mm-hmm.
So, whereas if I gave you a similarly complex paragraph about making soup, you probably have made soup, seen soup made, you know what soup is,
Mm-hmm.
and you have enough domain experience in cooking, including the vocabulary about simmer and brew and
Yeah.
stew and so forth. Um, you'll know enough to be able to piece together from that paragraph what is this author trying to tell me about making soup.
Yeah.
So much of what we want to be making sure schools are doing is really giving kids strong foundations in vocabulary, but also domain knowledges in sort of basic history,
Mm.
basic science. So they know enough about the world that when they start to read more sophisticated passages and textbooks and texts, as they get into those middle and upper grades in the sciences and history, they know enough to be able to figure things out because we've
Yeah.
already explained, for example, what's a democracy and what are the key concepts and also key vocabulary we use when we talk about democracies and how they work and voting and so forth.
Yeah. Yep, that totally makes sense. That's awesome. And so the when we take that into the classroom, so something these southern surge states are doing, it's different from what those non-southern states are doing.
That's right. And there are two, if I radically oversimplified the two things that they're doing, which is dangerous because they did lots of multi-layered things. So let me say
Okay.
at the outset, the work almost can't be radically oversimplified. But the two big things that they did effectively were they made efforts in teacher training and teacher coaching to make sure that teachers really understood how kids learn to read, really understood what good phonics instruction looked like,
Mm-hmm.
and how to get those reading foundations right.
Yeah.
So they all made those training and coaching investments in this science of reading. And they all, with the exception of Alabama, I'll get to that in a second, but Mississippi, Tennessee, and Louisiana made real investments in bringing knowledge building curriculum into the norm in their states. So curriculum that are designed for kids to be learning in English language arts,
Hmm.
and doing their reading and their writing tasks about science and history topics, so
Mm.
that as a part of the ELA work, they're getting that science and history vocabulary and domain knowledge
Yeah.
in the water.
Brilliant.
Um, Tennessee and Louisiana led with the knowledge building curriculum and then layered in more of the science of reading training. Mississippi and Alabama both started with the science of reading training, and Mississippi later layered in the knowledge building curriculum. Alabama, which has the newest and the smallest gains, but it is starting to register on the national radar. They plan to bring knowledge building curriculum into their schools in the next 2 years. So across these states, they all agree what the playbook should look like,
Hmm.
even if they had some modest differences in how they were executing.
Yeah. Okay. So let's take. Man, that's great here, especially as someone who's got whose family is from the South, has a lot of family in the South.
Yeah,
So go South. Um, take like what's an example of something that doesn't work?
it's a great question. I need to add one more thing to my answer,
Okay.
because we are having a policy conversation and I'm
Yeah.
oversimplifying too much. It must also be said that all four of these states at this point have passed a third grade retention bill, which suggests that if students aren't reading by the end of third grade, there's mandatory retention.
Oh.
This was a controversial policy.
Yeah.
And I'll be honest, when I first heard about this, I was disinclined to believe that this was necessary and worried about the risks of a policy like this.
Yeah.
The truth is, in all four states, the number of kids that are actually getting retained is fairly low,
Hmm.
even when these policies are in place.
Yeah.
Um, it's also devil in the details. Louisiana is only having their law go into effect just at this particular moment.
Okay.
So we can't even say that the Louisiana law has, years and years behind it. But
Right.
at this point, all four states have aligned around this. What they'll tell you in Mississippi is that what this does is it really focuses adults and aligns adult incentives to get every child reading, because of
Yeah.
course it's a painful decision to retain any child.
Yeah.
So um, when we talk about the retention laws, it's really this question of, does this change adult incentives and really get adults to focus so squarely on making all those other reforms work that in fact it um, it really does move the needle in terms of outcomes. That's the argument, and I think that policy, again, must be noted. But now let me go answer your question.
Yeah.
So, what doesn't work? Um, we know that teaches approaches to teaching reading that are designed more around kids picking things up themselves um, don't work.
Hmm.
So, there's an approach to reading called balanced literacy that, if we look at what really happened in those balanced literacy curricula, the designers were trying to design around a lot of choice for teachers and choice for students. So, choice for students means that when kids starting in kindergarten were going into schools, there would be a classroom library in the classroom, and students would spend a key portion of their ELA time picking out books that interested them from that classroom library and doing their own reading individually with those texts. And then teachers would go around and ask sort of similar questions about students about what was happening in the book.
Yeah.
That was a core part of the instruction. Those same programs also assumed that kids could learn phonics, what we would describe as more implicitly. Implicit phonics teaching might look like reading lots of poems to kids and assuming that if they use lots of poems and there's a lot of rhyming happening in the classroom, that kids will pick up that, which of those, letter sound correspondences match up
Yeah.
with each other.
Yeah.
Or implicit teaching of phonics might assume that I could teach a handful of the sounds and kids would figure out the rest if I gave them a starting point.
Yeah.
The truth is, we know that explicit teaching approaches when it comes to phonics work significantly better. You really do have to go through and explicitly introduce all of those sound letter correspondences for kids for, to get all of your learners to have that learning come together.
Yeah.
And we also know that some of those balanced literacy approaches that sounded really good, like kids reading about what they're passionate about and individually choosing texts, it sounds great. It sounds like it would be engaging for students. The trouble is, leaving students to be doing a lot of that work independently robs students of, again, more of those explicit experiences,
Yeah.
like the whole class reading a common text and teachers having the kids, okay, we've just read 4 pages of this book. Now let's stop and talk about what's happening and process. And here's a vocabulary word you might not know. And having those opportunities for the teacher to layer in more explicit support for students' understanding of what they're reading.
Yeah.
So that's just a couple of a couple of examples of something that, while I would never say that only explicit teaching and the teacher teaching everything is the way to go, there are an awful lot of ways that explicit teaching has been, you know, less embraced
Yeah.
in certain approaches to teaching and learning. And pretty consistently, if you go with the more explicit version, you find a stronger evidence base for it than some of these more, um, you know, more implicit or student oriented or independent types of learning.
Yeah, so that's really interesting. I think one important note, and you are kind of alluding to this, I think, is that designing curricula and designing programs and standards for a very large group of people is very different from what you would do if you're talking about one person. Because to hear you describe the implicit method of teaching, I'm pretty sure that's how I learned to read. You know,
Yeah.
my mom and my dad read to me a lot when I was a kid, and then at 3 or 4 I picked it up, and then I was reading very comfortably before kindergarten,
Yeah.
and I don't think I was getting phonics instruction, but then there are going to be some people for whom that works, and then there are going to be a lot of people for whom that doesn't work very well, who do need the explicit instruction, and if your basic approach is explicit, you're gonna catch a lot more people. Is that
Yeah.
yeah?
I think there are two things that we should sort of talk about when we're talking about these continuums.
Hmm.
Um, Maybe the most important continuum that we don't discuss a lot is the question of the novice to the expert learner,
Okay.
and what the novice learner needs to be understanding math, to be understanding how do I break down a new word when I experience it. That novice learner is going to need something meaningfully more explicit. And it's when you have
Right.
a base of knowledge in any category that you're more advanced. I might call a high schooler an advanced learner. I might call a a postgraduate an expert learner in a domain,
Hmm.
specifically in the domain they've studied, right?
Yeah.
So as students move along that continuum from total novice that can't recognize a word to a student that can read proficiently, has core writing skills, you can start later in that continuum to introduce more of those student centered, student led tasks and prompts. And you can introduce more independence into the work
Yeah.
because the kid has the core skills.
Yep.
Where we've gone wrong in a lot of approaches to teaching are we try to introduce things like student choice or project based learning or experience based learning. We try to introduce them to kids in early grades before we've given kids foundations.
Yeah.
So we're taking things that are successful for and preferred learning approaches for many in high school and above, and we're trying to inject them into elementary and middle school. And I think that's where we go wrong.
Yeah. Okay, that's really interesting. Okay, there's one big thing that we haven't really talked about yet that had a major impact over the last 10 years, and that
Yes.
was, of course, the pandemic. So,
Yes.
what happened during the pandemic is what we did at the time. Like, was it justified at the time, looking forward? And so, obviously, if we ran it back, if we had it, well, I guess this is the question. If we had a chance to do the pandemic again, what would you do differently if you had a magic wand?
It's a good question. We've learned something that I think many of us intuitively knew, but we learned that school's really important for kids. And it's important for kids. I feel like we learned as a country that school is incredibly important for children academically.
Hmm.
We knew before the pandemic that the cohort of students in Louisiana that we describe as the sort of Katrina cohort, where their schools were closed for a few months because of Hurricane Katrina. We know that the Katrina cohort had, you can look back at their learning 5 years later and you can see that cohort had different academic outcomes than kids that didn't miss 3 months of school. So
Hmm.
we knew that going into the pandemic, and then Americans took very different approaches. We had regions that kept their schools much more open and regions that kept their schools much more remote. But we learned that we had a repeat experiment in closures that were typically much longer than 3 months. Um, and we can see in the data that schools in regions that were closed longer do show more learning loss than school regions where it was open.
Hmm.
So, what would we do if we could do the pandemic over again? Um, I think our approach would look a lot more like Europe. If we look at European nations, and Sweden gets talked about a lot, but you can also look at Germany and Denmark and, um, not exactly countries that are known for being really flip about data, if you will.
Right. Yeah.
And in those countries, they, like we, closed their schools in the spring of 2020,
Hmm.
but they began reopening schools about 6 to 8 weeks after that initial closure. You started seeing Sweden never closed their schools, but in other countries, they started reopening schools, and schools were the first thing to open. And then they monitored very closely.
Yeah.
And the European schools chiefs even got together once in May and once in June, I believe. It might have been June and July, but in pretty early phases to report out on here's where we have schools opened, here's what we're seeing. And the consensus position across European countries was that schools were not, when they reopened schools, they didn't see COVID spread accelerate or decelerate.
Okay.
It appeared that reopening schools was just a,
Flat.
a wash on COVID spread and obviously much better for kids.
Yeah.
So by the time the fall school year rolled around, European schools were consistently opened, and we don't have any European countries whose school closure experience looked anything like ours. Now, of course, there'd be times that there'd be a COVID
Right.
wave that would go through, and during a large COVID spike, you might have so much student absence plus teacher absence due to illness that we would see closures for, when we had the waves that would come at the holidays, you'd see a 2-week closure in
Hmm.
a country because they recognized that they needed to let the virus kind of pass through
Yeah.
a particularly large spike. But that experience is what I would have liked to see for all American regions.
Yeah.
That experience is what they did in the overwhelming majority of Tennessee. It is what
Yeah.
they did in Florida. It is what they did in about 20% of US states. So it isn't even like we lack a proxy for that. But
So that's really
um,
interesting here, and this is where we get into the politics, and I write that my hope generally. I don't know if I really do this in every article, and certainly not in every podcast, but the idea is to kind of demystify the right for the left and vice versa. And this is
yeah,
something that so the irony here, I think, is that there are many on the left, and I personally lean left, that would identify themselves as pro science, pro data, all that. And here in this instance, we do have the data from Europe that I assume American educators had access to, American educators and policymakers, and would have been aware of that or could have been aware of that. And then in the U.S., the movement towards reopening schools was obviously much stronger in conservative states that um, I think, many of them made the argument that this is for the good of the children, but from the left, it was often looked at as a sort of COVID skeptic, anti-government sort of thing rather than this pro-children move. And now, in retrospect, so those states that did not close, I don't want to assume, but did they show less learning loss than like in New York and California and other states where I think there were longer shutdowns?
yeah, we do know that at a state level, the states that had there's a clear correlation between the length of your school closure and the amount of learning loss. So um,
Dang it.
that is that is clear and known at this point. So the
Yeah.
learning loss argument is there, and I think certainly when we speak to parents and you speak to medical professionals, we're also all pretty aware that that was a tough phase for kids in terms of their mental and emotional wellness.
Hmm.
So I watched my own daughter. I lived in New York City at the
Yeah.
beginning of the pandemic, and was one of the um, like you, I lean left. I've actually have a lifetime history of only voting on the left. So um, but so I was, counter to the approach in most of my political
Hmm.
uh, cohort, if you will. I was one of the people that was really closely following what was happening in Europe and so forth,
Yeah.
um, and advocating to reopen schools. And many of the parents that were talking about that were saying we need to get our kids back socializing with other kids. We're seeing too much teen depression, too much kids sitting in their room on their screens. I was one of the moms who was advocating for schools to reopen in New York City because when the pandemic started, I was based in New York City and I was watching a lot of this data that we talked about closely.
Yeah.
I have to note when you said earlier that the data about Europe should have been available, there was no national source that reported on this information. You had to be watching social media and looking at posts from around the country to even know that this was
Interesting.
happening.
So okay, so that's interesting. You're not getting this from the Times, the Washington Post, or anything. You're getting this from like Facebook.
No, and well, mostly it was actually Twitter was
Okay, Twitter.
the real the real international exchange point.
Yeah.
Um, love Twitter or hate it, it is a really good platform for
Yeah.
open posting that people can see across country lines.
Yeah.
So, if you wanted to know this information and you were looking closely enough, you could find out about these reopening experiences and the studies that were done in these countries. But you couldn't find it in the New York Times. You couldn't find it in the Washington Post until really none of this was discussed until months after US schools had already started the wheel turning on reopening for the fall.
Yeah.
So, to a regrettable degree, we missed that opportunity. But myself, watching my own daughter, um, after struggling to see New York City schools stay consistently open and watching my, at the time, third grader suffering from clinical depression symptoms, I said, my ex husband and I at the time said, all right, we need to get her to 5-day school.
Yeah.
We moved to the suburbs into a district that had 5-day school, and she became a different kid. It was like watching her blossom again. So we proved in other ways that school matters for kids, not just academically, but also socially and emotionally.
Yeah.
Um, and I like to think that if the pandemic recurred, that we would start to center evidence like that. But um, it was it remains disheartening for me as like to have seen us as a country go through this moment where things became so politically polarized that we weren't even having conversations that were really about what's the evidence on school reopening, who's doing this well, who's doing it poorly. We have some states that are open, some that didn't. What's happening to COVID spread? Instead, everyone in the country, left or right, seemed overly invested in who's a good guy or a bad guy,
Yeah.
and how do I paint the choices that are made by people on the other side of the political aisle as in some way irresponsible. Um,
Yeah.
our political polarization haunts us in so many ways. So,
It makes us dumb among many other things. But yeah, no, you're absolutely right. Yeah. Huh. Man. That's that's really interesting. So let's see what we've talked about. So we evidence wise, we have now, I think maybe more than we did 10 years ago, more than when you kind of started in on this work. We have pretty good evidence for the sort of reading instruction that works.
mhm.
We have pretty good evidence for how important school is for kids, not just as, not just for the purpose of educating them, but also for the purpose of educating them, socially and emotionally and all that. And we have, I think, some clear examples of states that have adopted these best practices and are seeing progress in the numbers, in the data. We have that good hard data. So what's the next step? Like is it? You're not just going to write one article, Southern Surge, it's going great, and then everyone sees that and we're good. What's the next step?
No, if anything, I wrote the Southern Surge article, as is true of a lot of things on my Substack. Um, I joke that I only write when I'm annoyed that no one else has written something that, and like it must be
Yeah,
said.
yeah,
And this is true of the Southern Surge. We've seen precious little media focus on the 4-state story.
yeah,
Um, we've seen the most focus on Mississippi discreetly, but a lot of people sit there saying, wait, Mississippi? It and when Mississippi started, they were 49th in the country in reading outcomes.
Yeah.
So lots of people look at Mississippi, and it's one of those states people like to make a punchline out of
Right.
on all things policy. So if you talk about just Mississippi, you get too much disbelief that, wait, Mississippi is leading the country in its reading instruction and how it's improved it.
Yeah.
Um, and so this four-state trend is something to talk about. What we should be watching right now is what's happening at a federal level. So Trump has vowed, and the you know Linda McMahon, his education secretary, have vowed. They've said fairly similar things about we need to return education to the states. What's a little ironic about that is that there's fairly little power held at the federal level in the first place. As we discussed before,
Yeah.
education standards, the Common Core wasn't a federal thing, it was 50 state things. So
Hmm.
we're already in a world where the power in education tends to be held, if not at the state level, it's overwhelmingly held at the district level.
Yeah.
So these question marks about, well, should more power be given to the states and or more flexibility for states in how they are allocated funds so that the state has more sway over how funds are spent than districts just getting money and figuring out, what to do with it of their own volition?
Hmm.
These are very present questions right now. What I'm looking to see is whatever changes are made by the leaders in the Trump administration, one of whom is likely to be a woman named Penny Schwinn, who just had her hearing last week to be the potential second in command of the Department of Education. She was the commissioner in Tennessee when they kicked off their work. So
Hmm.
it's encouraging to me, as I'm not a Trump voter, but
Yeah.
it's encouraging to me that there is one really strong former state leader that is likely to enter the administration. What I'm hoping to see is that there are some accountability provisions for states. That yes, states, we're going to return, we're going to send more power into your hands, but we're going to hold you more accountable
Hmm.
for having policies that look more like the states that are leaders.
Yeah.
And or we're going to introduce much more transparency for the country about which states are showing gains and which states aren't.
Yeah.
Um, that's what I would hope to see out of this wave, but it's anyone's guess whether things play out in the best case or the less ideal case scenario.
Right. Well, well, I mean, given the polarization, it's helpful that these southern surge states, they are all, they're all Republican led. And even if I know in your article you noted that the governor in Louisiana, when a lot of this was implemented, was a Democrat, but Republicans, they can take credit for it. Not in the they necessarily should, but they certainly can. And President Trump, I think, is not shy about taking credit for things when he has any plausible case or a deluxe one. Um, but so potentially this is something where it's helpful that these good things are happening and have happened in Republican-led states, and so theoretically through this Republican-led administration, we might see something of a national rollout or pressure or encouragement.
It's helpful, and I'd love to see that.
Yeah,
I would also be remiss if I didn't mention that states like Massachusetts, who actually have some of the stronger reading outcomes out there, although a significant portion of that's about their demographics, it's a more wealthy state than not. So
yeah,
their more privileged student cohort is helping carry their scores to a degree. But even Massachusetts is putting forward some reforms that, while not as stringent, maybe
hmm,
as what was done in the South, have a lot of policy approaches in common with what was done in these four states. So this
nice,
work isn't exclusive to red states.
right,
It is at this point dominated by red states, and I I hope we see more focus and conversation on the models like Massachusetts that are in fact proving maybe a little counter trend in terms of
yeah,
these shifts.
awesome. Well, Karen Vaites, it's been a pleasure. Uh, this is fantastic. People are listening. So you run the Curriculum Insight Project. Curriculum Insight Project has a separate Substack. Is that right?
We do have our own Substack there, yes.
Okay.
And so we have educators that are publishing pieces, and I will write to it too, but that's a broader effort to help people see into curriculum since it's such a difficult thing.
Yeah.
You can't you can't head out to Barnes and Noble and check out the curriculum
Yeah.
in your student school. So we really need to give even even districts and school board members ways of seeing into curriculum options that they're not using.
Yeah. So people can find you on Substack with the Curriculum Insight Project, which helped
Hmm.
run. You're getting a lot of stuff there, and then School Yourself.
That's right.
Okay. Anywhere else people should look for you?
No, I think I am me in most social media platforms and
Okay.
try to share things out that way too.
Perfect. Well, thank you very much.
Thank you so much for having me.
All right, and that was the interview. Thank you very much for listening. If you wouldn't mind, please do leave a review for the podcast. I believe those are important. And subscribe to the newsletter, which will be linked in the show notes or can be found at neverclosetheinquiry.substack.com. Thanks.